My son shouted, "Get out of this house. My wife is not comfortable having you around. Pack your things and be gone by morning." His wife stood there beside him, a smirk curling her lips. Not a word left my mouth. The next morning, I walked out, and I took $5 million with me. 1 week later, they were begging. I am Gerald, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As the founder of a successful heavy machinery empire, I thought I had secured my family's future, but I had to escape their toxicity. Nashville, Tennessee gave me no silver spoon to start with. Yet inside the grand custom-built home I'd spent years working to give my son a deep chill had settled into every room, every hallway, every corner. That enormous house, perfect hedges, luxury, everything, had quietly become a monument to entitlement, one I never set out to raise. Then came the crack of his palm driving down hard against the solid walnut dining table, splitting the silence of that cavernous place wide open. The sound cut through me like something physical. My eyes settled on his hand, pressed flat against the gleaming surface, smooth, unmarked, the hand of a man who had never once broken a sweat doing real work. At 35, my son Clifford had lived his whole life insulated from anything rough or difficult. His hands were soft, unblemished, pampered things. My own, folded quietly in my lap, told an entirely different story, a lifetime written in deep scars, hardened calluses, and knuckles bent out of true. Welcome to Alphadadstories, a place where real strength, hard-won wisdom, and the kind of family reckoning most people never talk about finally get their moment. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us. Hit subscribe if you want the next story to come straight to you, no hunting for it. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from today and what time it is where you are. I'd genuinely love to know who's sitting with this story. One quick note: some elements of this story have been dramatized for the purpose of telling it. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. "Get out of this house," Clifford shouted, his voice breaking at the edges, straining for an authority he had never truly earned. "Renata is not comfortable having you around anymore. You are ruining our peace of mind. Pack your things and be gone by morning." I slowly pulled my gaze away from his smooth hand and turned it toward my daughter-in-law's face. Renata stood half a step behind him, arms folded tight across her chest, but her eyes told an entirely different story. Discomfort had nothing to do with it. What I saw there was triumph. A cold, victorious smirk tugged at the corners of her mouth as she watched me absorb my own son's betrayal. Her fingers drifted up to idly trace the gleaming $22,000 bracelet resting at her wrist, the very one I had bought her just last month for her birthday. Clifford had told me she was feeling overlooked, that she needed a gesture to remind her she was a cherished part of the Mercer family. Now she stood there wearing my generosity as a weapon, while helping her husband push me out the door. The sheer audacity of it pressed down on the room like something you could almost touch. This was not just any house. This was the multi-million-dollar estate I had paid for outright. And that table, the one Clifford had just struck with such contemptuous disrespect, was the very first piece of furniture my late wife Elaine and I ever brought home together. I could still feel that sweltering July afternoon 40 years ago, peeling sweat-damp bills from a wad of crumpled, grease-stained cash earned during my first week of double shifts. I bought it so my future children would have somewhere solid to sit, to share a meal, to grow up feeling safe. For 4 decades, I breathed diesel fumes and swallowed construction dust and broke my back building Mercer heavy equipment. I started with a single beaten-down bulldozer I repaired with my own hands in the unforgiving Tennessee heat. From that, I raised an empire worth $40 million so Clifford would never know the hollow feeling of an empty refrigerator or the shame of showing up somewhere in torn shoes. My youth, my strength, my health, I fed it all into building a kingdom for him. And now here he stood at the center of the castle I'd erected, commanding the man who built it to leave. They waited to see what I would do. I could read the anxious tension pulling at Clifford's shoulders. He was bracing for a blow-up, expecting me to raise my voice, to weep, to drag out a long inventory of my sacrifices, or to beg him to remember what we once were to each other. He was prepared for the predictable meltdown of a wounded, confused old man clinging to a life that was slipping away. I gave them nothing, not a single tear, not one word spoken above a normal pitch. I simply looked at my son, really looked at him, and recognized the hollow, acquisitive stranger he had allowed himself to become. Then I gave one slow nod. I rose to my feet, the familiar protest in my knees, reminding me of that brutal winter of '98 when I poured concrete for our first major warehouse so Clifford's private school tuition wouldn't bounce. I turned my back on them both and climbed the grand staircase. The silence trailing behind me said more than any outburst ever could. In my room, I dragged a single worn leather travel bag from the closet. I left the tailored suits and the expensive watches, the ones they'd bought me using my own money, hanging right where they were. What I packed was simple 3 changes of clothes, my toiletries, and a framed photograph of Elaine. Everything I actually needed fit in one bag. The zipper's sound cut through the stillness as I pulled it shut. When I descended the stairs and moved for the front door, they were still rooted in the dining room, wearing matching expressions of mild confusion at my complete absence of resistance. They were certain they had won. They believed they had broken me, that I was retreating in full defeat. I stepped out into the cool Nashville night. The heavy front door clicked shut at my back, sealing off the life I had lived inside those walls. I walked the long curve of the driveway toward my old, reliable Chevy truck, the only vehicle in this world I actually cared about, a plain-spoken contrast to the imported sports cars occupying Clifford's multi-car garage. I dropped my bag onto the passenger seat and settled behind the wheel. The scent of worn leather and old motor oil brought me back to myself. I drew one long, steady breath. The grief of losing my son was real. I could feel its weight sitting low in my chest, but I pressed it down into the dark. Grief hollows a man out, and right now I needed to be sharper than I'd ever been. I pulled out my phone and opened my encrypted private banking application. The screen's cold blue light caught the ridges of the scars across my hands. I worked through the menus until I reached the master terminal for Mercer Heavy Equipment's corporate accounts. I found the specific blind trust account filed under Summit Ventures. That was the account where Clifford and Renata believed they had cleverly parked the company's $5 million liquid reserve, fully in their grip, untraceable, ready to be drained to bankroll their extravagant lifestyle beyond my reach. They had badly misjudged the man who designed the very system they were attempting to loot. I opened the founder's override interface. A security prompt demanded my biometric fingerprint and a backup passcode. I supplied both without so much as a tremor. Then the final prompt appeared bold and unambiguous on the screen: Initiate Emergency Clawback Protocol. This action cannot be reversed by secondary users. I looked up through the windshield at the house blazing with light. The silhouettes of Clifford and Renata moved through the kitchen, no doubt uncorking something expensive to toast their masterful victory over a helpless old fool. My thumb hung over the screen. I felt no pity. What I felt was the cold, surgical certainty of a man excising rot before it spreads any further. I pressed execute. 3 long seconds crawled by. Then the confirmation lit up: the dark cab emergency clawback initiated. $5 million successfully retrieved and secured in personal locked trust. I let out a slow, quiet breath. I hadn't merely walked out of their house. I had just torn the financial foundation straight out from under everything they thought they owned. They were toasting a victory in a mansion they could no longer sustain, drinking on credit lines that were moments away from being frozen solid. I turned the key. The old Chevy truck growled to life, a deep, steady rumble that swallowed the quiet of that manicured neighborhood whole. I pulled away from the curb and left them behind, my treacherous son and his smirking wife standing in the dark. They believed they had outplayed me. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of total devastation and why I had no choice but to press that button against my own son, we need to go back. Back exactly 3 months to an ordinary afternoon and a small lie about a tape measure that began unraveling everything I thought I knew. 3 months ago, my life felt as solid as the steel beams my company hoisted into the sky. I had no cause to think the ground beneath my family was giving way. It was a Tuesday in late October. The Tennessee heat had finally broken, replaced by a sharp crispness in the air that made a man grateful for strong coffee and the sound of a diesel engine turning over. I spent the morning at a new development outside Nashville, walking the site and inspecting excavators. I always preferred being on the ground, the smell of turned earth and the percussion of jackhammers. That was where I belonged. It was a reminder that I was still the man who built Mercer heavy equipment with a toolbox and a flat refusal to stay poor. That afternoon, a logistical snag forced operations to a halt. Rather than continue on to the corporate office, I pointed the truck toward home. My body was carrying a deep, bone-level fatigue. I wanted stillness before the evening set in. I didn't call ahead. It was my house. I had never once felt the need to announce myself before walking through my own door. I came up the driveway, gravel popping under the tires. The estate sat quiet and imposing. That grand colonial facade, the columns, the immaculate hedges, the whole careful presentation, stood as far from a raw construction site as anything I could imagine. I climbed the front steps, knocked the dried mud from my boots, and let myself in. The cool air of the foyer settled over me. Every surface inside gleamed, arranged by Renata to look like something out of a luxury catalog. The marble floors caught the afternoon light and threw it back in clean, bright planes. Every piece of modern art hung exactly level. It was a stunning house, but it carried the cold, untouchable feeling of a museum, rather than a place where people actually lived. I set my hard hat on the entryway bench and moved quietly down the main hallway toward the back of the house. My private ground-floor study sat just beyond the main living room. It was the one room in that entire mansion that still felt like it belonged to me. Old blueprints covered the shelves, and the heavy oak desk I'd used since the 90s anchored the center of it. My sanctuary. As I approached the heavy double doors, I caught a strange, high-pitched electronic beep, brief and sharp, followed by the soft sound of movement inside. I went still, every instinct pulled tight. Nobody was supposed to set foot in my study. Renata had her own sprawling home office upstairs, and Clifford almost never brought work home. I eased forward, pressed my palm against the cool wood, and nudged the door open just enough to see inside. Through the narrow gap, I found my daughter-in-law. Renata stood in the middle of the room with a commercial-grade laser tape measure in her hands. The small red beam swept across the space as she read the digital display and recorded figures in a leather notebook. She was fully absorbed, brow furrowed, working with the focused attention of someone conducting a task that mattered. I watched for a long moment, a slow, heavy unease settling in my gut. What possible reason did she have to be mapping the exact measurements of my private space? I pushed the door wide open. The hinges announced me with a creak. Renata spun around with a sharp gasp, and the tape measure fell from her hands and struck the hardwood floor with a clatter. For a fraction of a second, Her face went white, genuine alarm flaring in her eyes, but she recovered with the practiced ease of a gifted performer. The panic disappeared almost before I could register it, replaced by a warm, rehearsed smile. "Gerald," she said, her voice laced with artificial sweetness. "You startled me. You are home so early today." I didn't smile back. I moved further into the room, my eyes tracking from the device on the floor to the small notebook she was gripping. "What are you doing in my study, Renata?" I asked. The tone was measured, but there was no ambiguity in it. She gave a light laugh and stooped to retrieve the tape measure. "Oh, I was trying to surprise you," she said, resting a hand gently on my forearm. "Clifford and I were talking last night about how hard you have been pushing yourself lately. You are always complaining about aching joints after long days out at the sites. I wanted to get you a therapeutic massage chair for this room. I was just checking the corner by the window to make sure there'd be room for delivery. It was meant to be a special gift." She held my gaze with wide, guileless eyes, performing the role of devoted daughter-in-law without missing a beat. I looked down at her, aware of the persistent, dull throb in my knees and lower back. My joints do ache. That has never been a secret. It is a permanent souvenir from the brutal winter of 1997. I remember that winter clearly. The local economy was cratering and Mercer Heavy Equipment was perilously close to going under. We had secured a contract to build a logistics center, but a freak ice storm came in and threatened to destroy the concrete foundation. Miss the deadline and the penalty clauses would have wiped me out. I spent 72 straight hours working in freezing rain, my boots soaked through to the bone, as I personally guided the pouring frames, because half my crew had called out sick. Those 3 days cost me the cartilage in both knees damage that never fully healed. I endured all of it for a single reason. I needed that contract money to keep Clifford's private school tuition paid. I destroyed my own body so my son could sit in a warm classroom and learn to run the world. I looked at Renata's perfectly kept hands wrapped around the tape measure. The lie was smooth and warm, and dressed up in just enough fake family feeling to be convincing. I gave her a slow, measured nod. "That is very thoughtful of you, Renata. I appreciate the gesture. I really do." My voice gave away nothing of the dark suspicion coiling underneath. She smiled, visibly relieved that her performance had landed, and quickly excused herself something about fabric swatches she needed to review. I watched her all the way down the hallway, until she disappeared around the corner. Then I turned back to face the room. I crossed to the exact spot where she'd been standing when I first pushed open that door. I looked down at the point where the device had hit the floor. I picked it up and pressed the button. The red beam fired across the room and found its target. She had not been aiming at the empty corner by the window. There was no massage chair she'd been measuring space for. The dot of red light rested precisely on the inner frame of my double doors. I read the display. Exactly 36 inches. Something cold moved through my chest and down my spine. She was measuring the exact clearance needed to wheel a standard hospital bed straight into my private sanctuary. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the image of that red dot burning against my doorframe refusing to leave me. 36 inches. The precise width for a hospital bed. I had spent my life calculating structural loads. I understood what it meant when someone began preparing a space to carry serious weight. They were laying the groundwork to remove me. When daylight finally came up over Nashville, I did what I had done every morning for 40 years. I laced my boots and drove to Mercer Heavy Equipment. The smell of raw diesel and freshly turned earth reached me the moment I passed through the gates. It was the smell of my life's work. I moved through the staging yard trading nods with the foreman, feeling the deep vibrations of excavators warming up for the morning shift. This was my kingdom. I had dragged it up out of Tennessee dirt with my bare hands and sheer refusal to fail. I pushed through the glass doors of the corporate building, leaving the yard's roar behind for the measured quiet of the executive floor. I went straight to my office and settled into my chair at the oak desk. My morning routine was fixed and deliberate. Before I touched a single operational report, I checked the company ledgers. I entered my credentials into the banking portal and waited while the dashboard assembled itself on screen. Rows of reassuring numbers filled the display. Then my eyes reached the primary liquid reserve account, and my blood went cold. Where there should have been a solid $5 million, there was nothing. Zero. I leaned in toward the monitor as though proximity might make a different number appear. My fingers moved fast across the keyboard, pulling up the transaction history. The funds had not gone to payroll. They had not been applied to new equipment purchases. The entire $5 million had been wired out in a single transfer at 2 a.m. to an external blind trust registered under the name Summit Ventures. I had never encountered the name Summit Ventures in my life. My heart drove hard against my ribs. I reached for the desk phone, handshaking with barely contained fury, ready to dial the bank's fraud line and lock down every asset tied to the Mercer name. Before my fingers landed on the keypad, the office door swung open. Clifford walked in, holding a sleek ceramic coffee mug, his whole posture relaxed and unbothered. He wore a custom-tailored slate blue suit that fit him without a single wrinkle. "Good morning, Dad," he said with the easy, unearned confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. "I see you are looking at the quarterly accounts." I pulled my hand back from the phone and held my son's eyes, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. "Where is the $5 million liquid reserve, Clifford?" I asked, my voice quiet, controlled, and considerably more dangerous for it. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He took a slow, unhurried sip from his mug and offered me a smile edged with condescension. "Relax, Dad," he said, moving around to plant himself directly in front of my desk. "It is a simple tax optimization strategy. I moved the capital into a high-yield holding account with Summit Ventures. You taught me that we need to make dead cash work for us. The inflation rate was eating our reserves alive. The accounting department signed off on it yesterday afternoon. It is completely above board, and we are going to see a 12% return by the end of the fiscal year. You should be thanking me." I sat there in silence, studying the crisp lapels of his $3,000 suit. He looked like a corrupt Wall Street banker, not a man who had ever felt the true crushing weight of financial responsibility. He tossed around phrases like tax optimization with the breezy arrogance of someone who had never once gone to bed hungry. As he stood there smiling, all I could see was a freezing night in 1984 when my first supplier went bankrupt and left me buried under a massive debt. I remembered driving to a seedy pawn shop on the edge of town. I remembered sliding Elaine's diamond wedding ring, the one I'd spent 3 long years saving to buy across a scratched glass counter just to get enough cash to make payroll for my crew. I did that because in this business, cash flow is not some theoretical exercise you run on a spreadsheet. Cash flow is oxygen. Lose your reserves, and you lose your company, your men, and everything you built your name on. I constructed that $5 million safety net out of my own blood, so I would never have to surrender another piece of my soul to anyone. And my son had just gambled it away into a blind trust. He was lying to my face. The polished smoothness of his voice, the steady, unbroken eye contact, it was all far too rehearsed to be genuine. The very woman who had been measuring my doorframe for a hospital bed was married to the man who had just moved my life savings into the shadows. They were running a coordinated operation against me. If I erupted, if I demanded the money back on the spot, I would give the whole game away. He would know exactly how much I understood. I needed him to walk out of that room, convinced his deception had held. I deliberately released the tension from my shoulders. I let out a long, tired sigh, playing the role of the worn-out old patriarch who had simply fallen too far behind the pace of modern finance. "You are right," I muttered, pressing 2 fingers to my temple as though fighting off a headache. "You are right, Clifford. I am just set in my old ways. If accounting signed off, then I suppose it is fine. Just keep me completely updated on the yield reports." Clifford's smile spread into the wide-open look of a man who believes he has just won. "Of course, Dad," he said, pivoting toward the glass door. "Do not worry about a single thing. I have everything completely under control. You just focus on relaxing." He walked out and let the door fall shut behind him. I sat alone in the office, my blood running cold, with a quiet, terrible clarity. I pushed up from my desk, my mind already moving, calculating, strategizing, mapping out every counter-move available to me. I needed my lawyer on the phone. I needed a full audit of Summit Ventures. I turned toward the small credenza in the corner to retrieve my private leather briefcase. As I reached down, something stopped me. Wedged partially behind the large filing cabinet sat my heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder, the one that operated on a physical key that only I possessed. I stepped closer and examined the stainless steel cutting mechanism. Jammed deep into the sharp metal teeth lodged tight in the blades was a single strip of thick, watermarked bond paper. Someone had bypassed my security lock. Someone had stood in this room in the middle of the night, frantically destroying documents they could not afford to have found. I stared at those metal teeth, and a cold, settled certainty moved through me like a current. This office is supposed to be impenetrable. I hold the only physical key to this room apart from the master set locked inside the corporate vault. I walked to the heavy mahogany door, gripped the brass handle, and turned the deadbolt until it hit home with a solid, reassuring thud. I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows and brought the automated blinds all the way down, dropping the room into dim, protective shadow. What I needed now was absolute privacy. I returned to the credenza, knelt on the carpet, and eased the plastic collection bin out from beneath the shredder. I carried it to the desk and turned it over. A mountain of thousands of jagged white paper strips cascaded across the polished surface like a snowfall of buried secrets. This was no casual tidying up. This was the deliberate, calculated destruction of evidence clearly intended to stay permanently out of my reach. I pulled my leather chair in close, switched on the small brass reading lamp, and let the light fall over the chaotic pile. For 40 years, I have made my living spotting details that other men walk right past. Decades of reading complex architectural blueprints, calculating structural load tolerances down to the millimeter, working through convoluted legal contracts, hunting for the hidden traps. My mind remains considerably sharper than people care to credit. I can still recall the exact serial numbers of excavators I acquired back in the 1990s. I can name every foreman who ever ran a major site for Mercer Heavy Equipment. But over the preceding weeks, I had made one critical mistake. I had mentioned to my son that I'd been getting minor headaches, nothing serious. It was the straightforward result of long afternoons under the relentless Tennessee sun, combined with the grind of managing a complicated supply chain problem. I'd brought it up casually at dinner, ordinary conversation between a father and his son. I had no idea I was placing a weapon directly in their hands. They had taken my ordinary passing physical complaints and were systematically turning my own age into ammunition against me. I began the slow, painstaking work of sorting through the strips. I separated pieces by the subtle differences in paper texture. I looked for the faint, distinct watermark of the corporate stationery. I matched the curves of printed letters, aligning fragments of black ink the way a forensic investigator reassembles evidence at a crime scene. Hour after hour passed. My lower back settled into its familiar grinding ache, but I pushed it to the edges of my awareness. I did not stand to stretch. I did not reach for a glass of water. A dark, relentless focus had taken hold of me completely. The locked office held a silence that was almost physical, broken only by the soft movement of paper across wood and the occasional sound of clear tape being pressed down as I secured matching fragments together. The work was absolutely grinding. Nearly 3 full hours passed before anything coherent began to take shape on the surface of the desk. My eyes burned from working under the tight beam of the reading lamp, but I refused to stop until the final strip was pressed into its place. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled a long, unsteady breath, and looked down at what I had rebuilt. It was a formal, multi-page confirmation letter, bearing the ornate crest of the Pinnacle Neurological Institute, the most exclusive and expensive private medical facility in the state. I read the bold heading at the top of the page, and the words landed like a fist to the stomach. It was a confirmed appointment, scheduling a comprehensive evaluation. The stated purpose was printed in plain, unambiguous text across the center of the page. Severe cognitive decline and dementia evaluation. I read the line a second time, my mind pushing back hard against what my eyes were clearly showing me. I traced my finger down to the patient information section. Patient name, Gerald Mercer. Date of birth confirmed. Medical history noted as exhibiting recent signs of severe confusion, aggressive paranoia, and persistent memory loss. A slow, sickening wave of nausea moved through me. They were not simply after my liquid capital. They were actively constructing a fabricated medical record designed to strip me of my legal standing and my agency as a human being. I kept reading down the reassembled page. I needed to know exactly who had set this entire machinery in motion. There, under the section labeled Requesting Party and Primary Medical Proxy, was the name of the person who had initiated the whole monstrous scheme. It was Clifford Mercer, my own son, the boy I used to carry on my shoulders during summer fishing trips, the boy I had built an entire empire to protect. He had personally reached out to a high-end neurological clinic and fed them a completely invented story about my mental deterioration. He was carefully constructing the legal and medical foundation needed to have me declared wholly unfit to manage my own affairs, let alone a $40 million international company. The stolen $5 million was merely the opening move in a far larger and more sinister campaign. If they could successfully establish that I was suffering from severe dementia, they could trigger the executive succession clause buried in my corporate bylaws. Clifford would seize complete and uncontested control of Mercer Heavy Equipment, and I would be reduced to a helpless ward of the state locked permanently under his legal conservatorship. A cold sweat broke across my forehead as the full scale of their betrayal came into focus. I shifted my attention to the bottom of the reconstructed document, hunting for the final piece. The clinic required a signed consent form to begin the aggressive evaluation process, releasing them from legal exposure regarding patient privacy and procedural authorization. I found the signature line. The blood left my face. I sat motionless in the silence of that locked office. There, resting neatly on the dotted line, was an authorization signature. Not a clumsy forgery. Not a rough imitation drawn by an unsteady hand. It was my exact, distinctive signature executed with flawless precision, down to the specific pressure of the ink and the familiar slight drag of the pen on the final letter of my name. Mathematically perfect. But I swore on my late wife's grave and on every drop of blood I had poured into this company. I never signed it. I gathered the reconstructed fragments of the medical evaluation letter, slid them carefully into a thick manila folder, and locked it inside my briefcase. My pulse hammered in my ears, a steady, relentless rhythm of betrayal and cold fury. The perfect forgery on that clinic consent form was not an isolated act. It was the missing piece that made sense of the empty bank account. If Clifford and Renata could clone my signature well enough to erode my legal and medical standing, they were more than capable of using that same forged authority to drain Mercer Heavy Equipment of everything it held. I needed to understand exactly how the $5 million had slipped through the strict internal security protocols I had built myself. To find out, I couldn't go through my son. Clifford was too thoroughly prepared, too smooth and practiced in his deceptions. I needed to find the weakest point in his chain. I needed to get to the man who had physically processed the wire transfer. I left the office by way of the private executive stairwell, completely bypassing the main floor, where Clifford was no doubt moving around with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was already in charge. I went down 3 flights of concrete stairs into the dim, cool air of the underground corporate parking garage. The space was wide and hushed, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and damp concrete. I made my way to row 4 and took up a position in the deep shadows behind a pillar directly beside a silver sedan. It belonged to Alden, my chief accountant. Alden had worked for me for 15 years, a quiet, precise numbers man who rarely varied from his established routines. I knew he left the building at exactly 6:00 every evening to beat the traffic. I waited in the stillness, shoulders against the cold concrete pillar, the dampness working its way into my aching joints. At exactly 6, the elevator doors slid open with a heavy metallic sound. The sharp, echoing tap of dress shoes on concrete announced Alden's approach. I watched him walk toward his car, shoulders pulled inward, briefcase held tight against his body. He moved like a man bracing for something, eyes sweeping the empty garage, darting left and right. He reached into his jacket for his keys and fumbled them so badly they slipped free and hit the floor with a loud ringing crash. Before he could crouch to pick them up, I stepped out of the shadow. "Hello, Alden," I said, my voice splitting the silence of that garage like something physical. Alden lurched backward, his spine finding the door of the silver sedan. Every trace of color left his face. "Gerald!" He stammered, eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Sir, I assumed you had already left for the evening." I moved one slow, deliberate step toward him. "I am not going anywhere, Alden," I told him, holding my tone level but loading it with the full weight of my authority. "I want to talk about the corporate reserve accounts. I want to talk about Summit Ventures, and I want to know exactly why $5 million of my money left at $200 in the morning without my verbal confirmation." Alden swallowed hard, pressing himself flat against his car, like a man calculating an escape he already knew was impossible. "Gerald, I swear to you I was only following the directives I was given. Clifford brought the transfer request to my desk yesterday afternoon. He said you were restructuring the capital for a sensitive tax optimization strategy. I told him I needed your direct confirmation before releasing that volume of liquid cash." I pushed back, "Sir. I demanded to speak with you directly." "Then why did the money move, Alden?" I pressed, closing the distance until I could see the sweat collecting on his forehead. "If you pushed back, why is my account empty?" Alden's hands tightened on the handle of his briefcase until his knuckles went white. "Because Clifford provided the digital overrides," he said, his voice breaking with the effort of getting the words out. "He bypassed the verbal confirmation requirement by submitting a digitally encrypted authorization transfer form. It came directly through your secure executive portal. It carried your verified digital signature, your private clearance code, and a secondary biometric timestamp. The system accepted it as absolute, unquestionable authorization. Legally, as far as the system was concerned, you were the one initiating the transfer. I had no grounds to block the wire. I stared at the man who had managed my ledgers for 15 years. He was terrified, sheltering himself behind protocols and electronic signatures, trying to step back from the edge of what he'd allowed to happen. I leaned in closer, bringing my face within inches of his. "Alden, look at me," I said, dropping my voice to something just above a whisper. 15 years ago, you came into my office in tears. You were a junior accountant drowning in medical debt. Your daughter, your little girl, had just been diagnosed with aggressive lymphoma. Your insurance company had walked away, calling it a pre-existing condition. They denied coverage, and the hospital was demanding a deposit that was far beyond anything you could pull together. Do you remember that day? Alden closed his eyes. A single tear broke free and moved slowly down his pale cheek. I remember, sir. I remember every detail. I did not go to the board. I continued, my voice steady and without mercy. I did not run it through corporate channels, and I did not look for a tax optimization strategy. I opened my personal checkbook, and I wrote a check for $150,000. So your daughter could receive the chemotherapy she needed to survive. She is in college today, because I did not hide behind protocols. When my family needed loyalty, I bought it with my own blood. And now I am standing here asking you for the truth. You owe me the truth, Alden, not corporate cover, not Clifford's lies. Alden opened his eyes. The fear was still there, but it had been overtaken by something heavier: shame. He drew a ragged breath and slowly unzipped the top compartment of his leather briefcase. His trembling fingers reached inside and drew out a small, encrypted black USB drive. I knew something was deeply wrong, Gerald, Alden said in a low voice, pressing the drive into my scarred palm. Clifford was too aggressive, too insistent about getting the funds moved before the end of the business day. The digital signature was technically perfect, but the timing felt wrong to me. So I ran a back-end diagnostic on the transaction before the servers purged the daily logs. I captured the network data. I captured the exact point of origin for the digital authorization override. What is on this drive? I asked, my fingers closing around it. The exact internet protocol address that accessed your secure portal and generated the forged signature, he replied. It did not originate from your device. Take it. I left him there, got into my truck, and connected the drive to my laptop. The IP address was a precise match for Renata's personal MacBook. She had done it. I sat behind the wheel, holding that small plastic drive in my palm, my laptop screen casting a cold light over the digital proof of my family's treachery. The internet protocol address stared back at me, a hard, irrefutable link connecting the forged signature and the stolen $5 million directly to Renata. She had been sitting inside my house, quietly dismantling my life while Clifford played the role of the attentive son. They were operating as one unit, a pair of parasites. I shut the laptop and snapped my briefcase closed. I didn't head for the police station. I didn't reach out to my corporate legal team. If I confronted them now, they'd shrug it off as a simple misunderstanding. What I needed was to let them wade so deep into their own trap that there would be no climbing out. I had to hand them precisely what they were working so hard to fabricate. I had to become the hollow, deteriorating old man their scheme required. I turned the engine over and headed back to the estate, conditioning my mind for the most painful performance I'd ever have to give. The house was still when I finally stepped through the front door. Warm, golden light from the chandeliers spilled across the marble floors. I hung my jacket on the brass hook in the foyer and moved down the long corridor toward the sprawling gourmet kitchen. The room was spotless, outfitted with high-end appliances that Renata had demanded but almost never touched. I crossed to the massive 6-burner gas stove. My hands were completely steady as I reached out and turned the knob on the front right burner. The sharp clicking of the igniter came first, then the soft whoosh of the blue flame catching. I didn't set a pot or pan on the grate. I left the raw flame burning freely in that silent kitchen. I stepped back, drew a slow breath to quiet my hammering pulse, and knocked a stack of unopened mail from the counter. I scattered the envelopes with my boot, laying out a scene of sudden, uncharacteristic disorder. Then I simply stood near the large granite island, staring blankly at the open flame, and let the trap do its work. It took exactly 14 minutes for the sharp clicking of Renata's designer heels to carry down the hallway. She swept into the kitchen, phone in hand, scanning a message with an expression of mild irritation. She stopped cold the moment she spotted the mail scattered across the floor and caught the unmistakable smell of burning gas hanging in the air. Her gaze snapped to the open flame, then cut across to where I stood motionless beside the island. "Gerald, what are you doing?" she demanded, her voice clipped and edged with real annoyance. She rushed forward and twisted the knob shut, killing the gas, then wheeled around to fix me with a hard stare. "You left the stove burning with nothing on it. You could have taken the whole house down with you." I turned my head toward her slowly. I let my shoulders cave forward, shedding the upright posture of a commanding executive and replacing it with the tentative, unsteady bearing of a man unsure of himself. I made my eyes go slightly wide, conjuring an expression of deep, guileless confusion. I blinked several times as though trying to surface from somewhere heavy and thick in my mind. "I am so sorry, Elaine," I whispered, my voice laced with a trembling fragility I had carefully engineered. "I only wanted to warm up some water for tea. I suppose I just forgot to put the kettle on." The silence that settled in afterward was dense and loaded. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers tighten around that expensive phone. Renata didn't move to comfort me. She didn't offer a single flicker of real worry or care for her supposedly addled father-in-law. Instead, her eyes lit up with a bright, hungry gleam. The irritation drained from her face, and what took its place was a look of sadistic, triumphant delight. She understood that the narrative she and Clifford had been constructing was, as far as she could see, playing out right before her. She raised the phone and began firing off a rapid message with both thumbs. She was undoubtedly texting Clifford to report that the clueless old man was finally coming apart at the seams. While she typed away in her triumph, my gaze drifted past her shoulder into the adjoining living room. My eyes came to rest on the massive stone fireplace mantel dominating the far wall. I built that mantel with my own hands 25 years ago. I spent weeks hunting down the right reclaimed timber, cutting and sanding each piece until it was smooth as polished glass. I built it because my late wife Elaine had always dreamed of a grand fireplace where we could hang family portraits and gather during the holidays. I built it out of nothing but love for a woman who carried more integrity in a single breath than Renata could comprehend in an entire lifetime. Standing there, pretending to confuse this grasping, parasitic stranger for the woman I had loved, turned my stomach. It took every single ounce of discipline and willpower I possessed not to drop the charade. Every instinct screamed at me to straighten my spine, level a finger at the door, and drive her out of my home on the spot. But I kept my shoulders rounded. I kept my gaze wide and bewildered, swallowing the bitter burn of my own pride. I had to let them take the battle so I could obliterate them in the war. I murmured another soft apology about feeling unusually worn down and shuffled slowly out of the kitchen. I made my way into the main living room and sank heavily onto the large leather couch. I drew a woven throw blanket up over my chest and let my eyes close, allowing my breathing to settle into a slow, even rhythm. I lay there without moving, feigning a deep and exhausted sleep. I waited in the stillness, trusting that Renata's towering arrogance would make her sloppy. 10 minutes later, her soft footsteps entered the room. She stood over me for a long moment, watching my chest rise and fall. A quiet scoff of contempt escaped her. She was clearly satisfied that I was dead to the world. Then came the soft, digital chime of an outgoing call connecting on her phone. She drifted toward the large bay windows, putting a few yards between us. Her voice dropped to an urgent, animated whisper. But in the absolute quiet of that house, I caught every word with chilling clarity. "Yes, Clifford, I'm telling you he is completely losing it," she whispered. "He left the front burner running with nothing on it, and he actually called me Elaine. The timing couldn't be more perfect. The doctor is coming Friday afternoon for the private in-home assessment. You just need to make sure the old man stays put and keeps away from the construction site. We only need to get him through the door. Once he signs off on the evaluation, the $40 million company is ours." I lay perfectly still on that leather couch until the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 in the morning. Renata had retreated upstairs hours before her footsteps dissolving into the hushed luxury of the estate. I gave it another full hour just to be sure. The house was sound asleep. At precisely 3:00 in the morning, I threw back the woven blanket and got to my feet. The dull ache in my knees flared at once, a sharp reminder of the physical price I'd paid, building the very wealth my son was now trying to take. I pushed past the pain. I moved through the darkened living room without a sound, collecting my heavy leather jacket and car keys from the foyer. I didn't risk the loud click of the heavy oak front door carrying up the grand staircase. Instead, I slipped out through the side entrance near the pantry, stepping into the biting Tennessee night. The cold hit me like a blade, sharp and clean in my lungs, as I walked quickly down the long gravel driveway. I had parked my old, reliable Chevy truck near the front gate on purpose, well clear of the motion sensor lights blazing around the main garage. I climbed into the frigid cab, turned the key, and listened to the heavy diesel engine grumble to life. I pulled away from the fortress I had spent a lifetime building, threading the dark, winding roads toward the quiet outskirts of Nashville. My destination was a 24-hour roadside diner located just off the interstate highway. The place glowed with harsh neon against the night, ringed by a sprawl of massive 18-wheelers. It smelled of burned coffee, sizzling bacon grease, and old cigarette smoke. It was exactly the kind of place where no one looked twice. I pushed through the glass door. A small brass bell gave a feeble ring above my head. The diner was nearly empty, just a handful of worn-out drivers hunched over bad coffee. I moved straight past the sticky front counter and made for the last booth in the darkest corner of the room. Dorian Kellner was already there, nursing black coffee from a chipped white mug. Dorian was my primary corporate attorney. He was a ruthless, razor-sharp, deeply unsentimental man with a mind that worked like a steel trap. He had no use for family drama, emotional entanglements, or the niceties of polite society. Dorian cared about one thing only: winning, and he had destroyed every person who ever made the mistake of reaching for my corporate assets. He had on a sharp, custom-tailored slate blue suit that looked thoroughly out of place in a diner like this, his expensive leather briefcase sitting quietly on the seat beside him. "You sounded like a man heading to his own funeral on that call." Dorian said, his voice flat and analytical. He skipped any pleasantries. He simply set his mug down and fixed me with a cold, calculating stare. I slid into the booth across from him. "I am not heading to a funeral, Dorian. I am preparing to conduct one." I reached inside my leather jacket and drew out the thick manila folder I had secured earlier. I set it down on the laminate table between us. I lifted the flap and carefully pushed the reconstructed medical evaluation letter across to his side. Dorian slowly lifted the taped-together document. His dark eyes moved across the text, rapidly taking in the damning details of the severe cognitive decline evaluation and the flawlessly forged signature at the bottom. He didn't register shock. He simply tightened his jaw. I reached into my pocket again and set the small black USB drive right beside his empty coffee mug. My chief accountant pulled that data straight from the internal server logs. Tonight, I said, keeping my voice even despite the fury smoldering in my chest. Clifford used a digital override to move the $5 million corporate liquid reserve into a blind trust called Summit Ventures. That drive holds the specific Internet Protocol address that executed the transfer. It points directly to Renata's personal laptop inside my own house. Dorian picked up the drive with 2 fingers, handling it like a loaded weapon. He opened his leather briefcase and produced a laptop. He flipped the screen open, keyed in a sequence of security passwords, and slotted the drive into the side port. The glow of the screen threw sharp light across his angular face. We sat in weighted silence while the weary drivers around us worked through their meals. For 5 minutes, Dorian's fingers moved swiftly across his keyboard, pulling corporate registry data from offshore databases. I watched his eyes narrow as he worked through the financial web my son had built. Summit Ventures is not a legitimate tax optimization vehicle, Dorian finally said, his voice stripped of any warmth. It is a hollow shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I traced the primary beneficiary of the trust. It belongs to a man named Conrad Baxter. I frowned, the name pulling at something buried in my memory. Conrad is Renata's older brother, I said, the pieces falling into place with a sickening thud. He is a disgraced cryptocurrency broker. Clifford cleared a gambling debt of his 3 years ago to keep the family name out of the mud. Dorian turned the laptop screen so I could see the columns of financial data. Conrad is exactly who they're using as their primary funnel, Dorian explained. They are cycling your $5 million through 3 separate offshore accounts to scrub the trail clean. They are effectively running the stolen capital through Renata's financially ruined brother to launder it, making it untraceable by the time it reaches their private accounts. I pressed back against the diner seat, absorbing the full depth of their coordination. They had turned my own family into a criminal operation. They actually stole $5 million. I muttered, staring at the figures on that screen. Dorian snapped the laptop shut, the sound cutting through the diner noise. No, Gerald, he corrected, dropping his voice to a whisper. The $5 million is just their security deposit. The real prize is the $40 million heavy machinery empire you spent 4 decades building. They are using the stolen cash to fund their exit. But the medical document you found, that is the actual murder weapon. I stared at the letter lying on the table between us. Dorian leaned forward, pressing both palms flat against the laminate surface. If that doctor walks into your home Friday afternoon and declares you incompetent due to dementia, your signature on that consent form automatically hands Clifford power of attorney. He will have the legal authority to liquidate every asset, every warehouse, every piece of equipment you own. You will be stripped of your rights, confined to your own home, while they dismantle everything you built. The full horror of what that legal reality meant settled over me like ice water seeping into my bones. My son was not merely a thief, he was a monster who intended to bury me alive. Dorian glanced at his watch. Today is Tuesday morning. The private doctor is officially scheduled to arrive at your estate on Friday. That gives us exactly 72 hours to construct a trap so devastating they won't see it until it has already closed around them. Dorian's grim words hung in the stale diner air like a sentence being read aloud in court. 72 hours. That was all the time I had left to dismantle my own son before he could legally erase my existence entirely. I left the roadside diner just as the first thin light of dawn began splitting the Tennessee horizon. I didn't head straight back to the estate. Instead, I drove to a specialized electronic surveillance shop on the industrial side of Nashville, sitting in my truck until the owner finally turned the lock on the front door. I went in and bought 3 highly advanced micro cameras. They were cleverly disguised as ordinary mobile phone charging blocks. They plug directly into any standard electrical wall outlet, drawing continuous power while simultaneously recording high-definition video and audio to a secure encrypted cloud server. To any untrained eye, they were completely invisible. I returned to the sprawling mansion just before 9 in the morning. Clifford had already left for the corporate office, fully confident that his wire transfer was safely buried in his Cayman Islands shadow account. Renata was out at one of her absurdly expensive morning Pilates classes. The house was entirely mine, leaving me free to work without interruption. I moved into my private ground floor study, the very room where Renata had been quietly measuring the doorframe for my future medical prison. I plugged the first charging block into the outlet directly across from my old heavy oak desk, angling the wide-angle lens to give it a clean, unobstructed view of the entire room. I had spent my entire 40s learning to diagnose invisible microfractures in massive industrial crane engines. I would spend hours suspended 50 feet in the air, working with specialized ultrasonic testing equipment to locate microscopic weaknesses in solid steel blocks before the whole machine gave way under a heavy load. It demanded immense patience, a trained eye, and an intimate understanding of where things quietly fail. Compared to that kind of painstaking engineering work, finding the perfect hidden angle to expose a rat moving through my own house was barely an inconvenience. I knew exactly where people's eyes went, and more importantly, where they never looked. I moved down the hallway into the main living room. This was the nerve center of their daily routine, the space where they casually mocked me over expensive imported wine. I found a low electrical outlet tucked just behind a decorative side table perfectly positioned to frame the large leather couch and the stone fireplace mantel. I plugged the second camera in, adjusting the tiny lens until the seating area came through with absolute clarity. Then I moved into the sprawling gourmet kitchen. I chose an outlet positioned directly above the granite island, right beside the designer espresso machine. This was the exact spot where Renata liked to stand and fire off frantic texts to my son every time I let a moment of confusion show on my face. I plugged the third and final charging block into the wall and verified the hidden indicator light. Inside 20 minutes, the house was fully wired, their secure, luxurious stronghold transformed into a seamless, inescapable trap. I spent the remainder of Wednesday steeling myself for the performance of a lifetime. I needed to offer them an opening so perfectly tempting they couldn't afford not to take it. I needed to physically remove myself from the picture, leaving them alone and unobserved to make their final moves. Thursday morning came in under a heavy gray sky. I descended the grand staircase carrying a large, faded canvas duffel bag stuffed with flannel shirts and heavy outdoor boots. Clifford and Renata were perched at the kitchen island, sipping coffee and speaking in low, tight voices. They went quiet the instant my boots touched the marble floor. I let my shoulders drop, sliding back into the posture of a worn-down, fading old man. I crossed into the kitchen and let the duffel bag fall to the floor with a loud, careless thud. Clifford's eyes moved from the bag to my face, his brow creasing in poorly rehearsed concern. "Where are you going, Dad?" he asked, setting his mug down on the granite counter. I released a long, ragged sigh and pressed my fingers to my temples, as though fighting through a wave of disorientation. "I am taking a trip, Clifford," I told him, my voice soft and unsteady. "I am driving up to Montana for a 3-day fishing trip in the mountains. Before I tell you what was set in motion at that diner booth and what it would ultimately cost the people who believed they had already won. Let me ask you something. If you discovered that someone in your own household had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you gather every piece of proof first and let them believe they were still safe? My head has been feeling so incredibly foggy lately. I keep losing track of simple things like the stove the other night. I just really need some fresh mountain air to clear things out. I need a few days away from the city noise to rest and try to think straight again. Absolutely, Renata and Clifford exchanged a rapid, lightning-fast glance. It was a look of pure, undisguised ecstasy. A 3-day absence meant I would be completely out of the state on Friday afternoon. It meant I would conveniently miss the private neurological evaluation they had arranged in secret. But more than that, it handed them exactly the kind of proof they needed of my supposed mental unraveling. What sort of competent, clear-headed chief executive walks away from a $40 million company on a Thursday morning to go wandering toward the frozen mountains? It was precisely the erratic, irrational behavior they needed to place before a judge in order to secure full power of attorney. "That sounds like a genuinely wonderful idea, Dad," Clifford said, rising quickly from his stool, barely able to contain the surge of adrenaline running through him. "You have been pushing yourself far too hard lately. A quiet fishing trip is exactly what you need to get your head right. You go take care of yourself. I will handle everything at the office. Don't worry about a single thing. Let me carry that bag out to your truck." He snatched the duffel from the floor, his face practically lit up with barely concealed excitement. I followed him out through the front door and down the long, sweeping driveway. Renata stood on the front porch, her cashmere cardigan pulled snug around her shoulders, giving me a warm, supportive wave that turned my stomach inside out. Clifford heaved my bag onto the passenger seat of my old, reliable Chevy truck and pushed the heavy door shut behind it. I turned the ignition and let the diesel engine rumble to life. I gave my treacherous son one last vacant smile and pulled slowly away from the estate. But I did not point the truck anywhere near Montana. I drove exactly 2 miles down the highway and pulled into a cheap, windowless roadside motel. I paid cash for a room, bolted the wooden door behind me, and settled in at the small desk. I opened my laptop connected to the encrypted server and trained my eyes on the live camera feeds. The bare walls of that motel room pressed close around me. My entire focus narrowed to the glow of that screen. For 24 grinding hours, I sat in a worn armchair, keeping myself alive on bitter black coffee and raw determination. I watched the live feeds sweep through my estate, seeing my own home through the cold, unblinking eye of a hidden camera. Thursday bled into a restless night, and Friday morning crawled forward with excruciating slowness. Clifford and Renata moved through the house with a sickening ease, utterly unaware that every murmured word was being captured and stored. They were supremely confident in the perfection of their plan. At precisely 2:00 on Friday afternoon, the camera concealed in the living room outlet caught the heavy oak front door swinging wide. Clifford stood in the entryway, eagerly welcoming someone in. The man who crossed my threshold did not carry himself like any medical professional. He wore no white coat, and his eyes held none of the warmth a healer should have. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, a crimson tie and polished Oxfords that struck sharply against the marble floor. He gripped a slim leather briefcase with the coiled posture of a corporate hitman, not a physician. Clifford guided him into the center of the living room and steered him toward the large leather couches sitting squarely in the frame of my hidden camera. Renata came down the grand staircase in a conservative navy dress designed to make her look the picture of respectability. She greeted the man with a conspiratorial smile. The three of them settled around the glass coffee table, I pressed closer to the laptop screen, my heart slamming against my ribs. I expected the man to produce diagnostic instruments. I braced for some hollow pantomime of a medical interview. Instead, he set the slim briefcase flat on the glass table and snapped the brass locks open. He did not ask a single question about my health. He did not inquire about my whereabouts. He knew exactly what he had been hired to do, and conducting a genuine medical examination was nowhere in that understanding. Clifford reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and produced a remarkably thick manila envelope. The heavy swell of it left no doubt about what was inside. It was packed with tightly banded stacks of untraceable cash. Clifford slid the bulging envelope across the glass table. The man in the tailored suit didn't trouble himself to open it and count. He simply laid his hand over it, gave a single nod of agreement, and tucked the bribe into his inner pocket. The ease of the transaction was sickening. This was not a man selling his integrity for the first time. With the payment secured, he reached into the open briefcase and drew out a neat stack of legal documents. Even through the video feed, I could make out the bold letters printed across the top of the page without difficulty. It read, "Official Medical Declaration of Incompetence and Custodial Conservatorship." The document was already filled out in full. My legal name, my date of birth, and my home address were cleanly typed into every required field. The man produced a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He did not pause or hesitate. He bent over the table, touched the pen to the paper, and signed his name across the bottom of the evaluation in a few brisk strokes. He pressed his official medical credential seal down beside his signature, lending the weight of his license to a devastating, life-destroying lie. With that single flourish of ink, he had formally declared me a person suffering from severe, irreversible cognitive dementia. He had stated under the sworn authority of his medical credentials that I was wholly unfit to manage my personal finances, my health care, or my $40 million corporate empire. He pushed the freshly signed, ruinous document across the table toward my son. Clifford stared at it, his eyes wide and glittering with a toxic, consuming greed. He reached out and touched the paper as though it were solid gold. The corrupt doctor snapped his briefcase shut with a sharp, ringing click. He looked squarely at Clifford, his face empty of anything resembling human feeling. "This gives you full, uncontested conservatorship," he said, his voice flat, cold, and utterly professional. "He is legally a ghost now." I sat alone in that dark motel room, my hands trembling as those words rang through the small laptop speakers. He is legally a ghost now. 40 years of brutal backbreaking work. Decades of pouring my blood, my sweat, and the best years of my life into building something worthy to leave my only child. And my son had just paid a stranger to erase me with a single signature. I was a ghost inside the kingdom I had built, not killed by any blade, but by naked, bottomless greed. On the screen, the man in the tailored suit rose, gave Renata a brief, businesslike nod, and walked out the front door, leaving my treacherous family alone to savor their win. The moment the front door clicked shut, Clifford let out a loud, breathless laugh, the sound of a man completely undone by euphoria. He shot up from the leather couch, snatched the legal document, and kissed the paper. "We did it!" Clifford shouted, pivoting toward the expensive mahogany bar cart in the corner of the room. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter filled with my most expensive, rare bourbon. He poured 2 generous glasses, the amber liquid sloshing over the rims of the crystal. He turned back and held one out to his beaming wife. "To Summit Ventures," Clifford cheered, lifting his glass high. "And to the new, undisputed Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Heavy Equipment." Renata took the glass from his hand, the diamonds catching the bright afternoon light. She brought the bourbon slowly to her lips, her gaze drifting down to the signed declaration of incompetence resting on the coffee table. She smiled a deep, terrifyingly cold expression that stripped her beautiful face of anything warm and left something monstrous in its place. She moved closer to Clifford and rested her hand lightly against his chest. I watched her lips begin to move, steeling myself for another toast to their grand financial conquest. But it was Renata's next sentence that shattered my heart completely and reforged it into something cold and unbreakable. "You know, darling," Renata whispered, her voice carrying a cruel, casual indifference that made my skin crawl. "Now that we have full legal authority over his estate and his medical directives, we really don't need to sit around waiting for his health to fail on its own. I already toured that awful underfunded state facility near the border. We can have him committed to their maximum security psychiatric ward by Monday morning. And with the medication protocols I've authorized, the clueless old man will have forgotten his own name before the month is out." I sat in the dim quiet of that motel room, the laptop screen throwing pale light across the peeling wallpaper. Renata's words drifted in the stale air like something poisonous coating my lungs with every breath I drew. A maximum security psychiatric ward, aggressive medication protocols. She had mapped out my destruction with the breezy detachment of a woman selecting new curtains. I watched her smile on the digital feed, her eyes alive with a dark, predatory gleam. She had just proposed chemically erasing my mind, and she looked radiant doing it. She turned from the forged document and drifted toward the mahogany bar cart, trailing her manicured fingertips along the rim of the crystal decanter. "So," she murmured, lifting another slow sip of my finest bourbon to her lips. "What exactly are the logistics of this transition? What's the precise plan for when the foolish old man drives back from his little mountain fishing trip Sunday evening? We can't have him wandering the estate while we restructure the corporate accounts and change the banking access." Clifford let out a sharp, hollow laugh. It was a soulless sound that traveled through the high ceilings of my living room and carried clearly through the tiny laptop speakers. There was not a trace of human warmth or familial feeling anywhere in it. "We don't let him back through the door," Clifford stated, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The second his truck rolls into the driveway, we hand him his bags and put him out. I've already got the private medical transport van reserved and paid for. They'll be sitting right outside the main gate. We put him directly into the back and send him on his way." Renata raised a sculpted eyebrow, a small smirk curling at her lips. "And you're absolutely certain about the facility you selected?" she asked. "We need somewhere secure enough to keep him quiet while we finalize the corporate transition. We can't have him calling the board of directors or getting word to his corporate attorneys." Clifford took a long pull from his glass, his face settling into a mask of cold, calculated arrogance. "Don't worry about his lawyers, Renata. I chose a Tier 3 state facility in the worst pocket of the city. It's the cheap one, the place where the county parks wards of the state who have no one left to speak for them. Chronically underfunded, perpetually understaffed. There are no private phones, no unmonitored visits, and they certainly don't take the complaints of their dementia patients seriously. He's out of his mind anyway. He won't be able to tell the difference between our estate and a county holding cell." Clifford leaned back into the leather cushions, a look of absolute triumph settling across his face. "He won't last 6 months in there. He won't last 6 months in there." The sentence bounced around the walls of that cramped motel room again and again. I stared at the digital image of my son, a man who carried my blood, my name, my face, and recognized nothing of myself in his soul. As he casually charted the timeline of my slow death in a neglected state facility, a memory came surging up from somewhere deep and buried. It was a savage winter night nearly 35 years ago. A freak blizzard had buried the city under 3 feet of ice and snow. The power grid had failed completely, plunging our small starter home into freezing, impenetrable darkness. Clifford was only 5 years old. He had spiked a sudden, terrifyingly high fever that was throwing his tiny body into violent, uncontrollable convulsions. The emergency lines were dead. The roads were impassable. I didn't pause for a single second. I bundled my burning, shivering boy in 3 heavy wool blankets, strapped him against my chest, and I walked. I carried him through that howling, blinding blizzard for 4 agonizing miles. The wind cut through my coat, like something sharp and merciless. The snow came up to my thighs, dragging at my numb legs with every exhausting stride. My lungs felt scorched, and my muscles begged me to fall. But I kept moving. I pushed through that frozen nightmare because the small, fragile boy pressed against my chest was every reason I had for being alive. I would have torn my own heart out and offered it freely if it meant keeping him breathing for 1 more hour. I had built Mercer heavy equipment bleeding for it, sacrificing the best years of my life simply so that boy would never have to know the cold terror of having nothing. And now that same boy was standing in the home I had given him, drinking the bourbon I had bought, calmly calculating the schedule of my demise. He looked at me and saw disposable baggage, a temporary obstruction between himself and a $40 million inheritance. Not a father who gave him everything, just a problem to be quietly locked away in some filthy, forgotten facility to rot. The scale of his betrayal moved beyond what ordinary rage could contain. It passed through disappointment entirely and arrived somewhere else, a place of absolute terrifying clarity. The son I had raised, the boy I had loved with every last piece of myself, no longer existed. Perhaps he never truly had. I reached out slowly and laid my rough, scarred right hand flat on the warm surface of the laptop. The suffocating weight of grief was simply gone. The hot, burning pressure that had sat at the back of my throat had vanished entirely. The anguish of a betrayed father had dissolved into that stale motel air, leaving nothing in its place but the cold, tempered steel of a ruthless, seasoned executive. The tender, forgiving father who had once carried his feverish son through a winter storm was dead, quietly killed by the very boy he had fought so hard to save. I leaned forward and pressed the laptop screen down. It snapped shut with a clean, decisive click. The voices of my treacherous family cut off mid-celebration, swallowed by silence. I sat alone in the dim room, my mind moving with a cold and terrifying precision. I drew my phone from my coat pocket and dialed a secure private number. The line rang exactly twice before that familiar, unsentimental voice came on the line. Strankendu. I said, my voice stripped of everything except purpose. It is time. Initiate the Founder's Protocol. Dorian didn't ask questions. He told me to be at his office in 45 minutes. I pocketed the phone and got to my feet. The air felt weightless. Something enormous had been lifted from me. I walked out into the cold night, got into my truck, and drove toward the Nashville skyline. I used my keycard to pass through the security gates at the corporate building. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor and stepped into the marble reception area of Dorian Kellner's law firm. He was in his corner office behind a mahogany desk buried under stacked legal documents. He looked up, his dark eyes sharp as ever. "You look remarkably composed for a man whose family just tried to have him legally erased," Dorian said. I sat down. "I'm composed because the mourning period is finished," I told him, my voice carrying none of the hesitation a father should feel. "They want to play at corporate ruthlessness, but they have no idea who wrote the rules. I want you to activate the hidden contingency." Dorian offered a razor-thin smile. "The Founder's clawback clause," he murmured, drawing a dust-covered binder from his desk drawer. It's been over 20 years since we drafted that provision. When I had incorporated Mercer Heavy Equipment all those decades ago, I understood the dangers that come with building an industrial empire. Hostile takeovers and internal treachery, those were never abstractions to me. They were simply facts of the business world. I had refused to leave everything I built exposed and undefended, so Dorian and I had quietly embedded a highly classified legal mechanism directly into the foundational charter of the company. A unilateral kill switch. The clause established that as sole founding chairman, I held the absolute unquestionable legal authority to instantly freeze, reverse, and seize any transfer of corporate capital the moment I suspected fraudulent activity. It completely bypassed the board of directors and the chief operating officer. Clifford believed he was clever for forging a digital signature to push through a wire transfer, but he was entirely ignorant of the fact that I was holding the remote detonator. Dorian opened the binder and began pulling out the original documents. We need to prepare the sequence of the counterstrike, I directed. First, I want you to draft Clifford's official termination papers. Termination for extreme documented gross misconduct. I want him stripped of his title, his privileges, and his entire corporate pension. Lay out the specifics of the unauthorized wire transfer and the forged digital signature in exact detail. Make it so airtight that no labor attorney in the country would dare take his case. Consider it done, Gerald, he replied. What is the second step? The second step is the criminal referral, I said. I want every piece of evidence we have assembled compiled into a single package, the network logs tracing Renata's internet protocol address, the background investigation connecting Summit Ventures to her disgraced brother, and the audio recording of their explicit conspiracy to bribe a physician and have me committed to a maximum security psychiatric facility. Bundle all of it into a comprehensive legal dossier and prepare it for immediate delivery to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are going to hand the federal prosecutors a watertight case for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and aggravated elder abuse. Dorian nodded, opening a new window and beginning to compile the criminal referral file. They are staring down decades in federal prison for a coordinated fraud scheme at this level, he observed without any particular emotion. And the third step? He asked. I want their financial lifelines cut completely, I commanded. Freeze every corporate credit card registered to Clifford's name. Kill Renata's access to the executive expense accounts. Revoke their corporate healthcare coverage and block them from the company vehicle fleet. They have been living like royalty on my money while scheming to put me in the ground. I want them to run straight into an unforgiving wall the instant this trap closes. I want them pulling out those gleaming platinum cards to toast their glorious victory, only to find out they have nothing left. Dorian let out a quiet, dry chuckle as he logged into the banking dashboard and began methodically terminating their account access, one line at a time. It is an elegant strategy, Gerald Kuhn, he admitted. But the timing has to be exact. When do you want me to bring the hammer down? I looked out through the wide glass window at the dark city skyline and worked through the precise sequence of their destruction in my mind. We wait, I said, my voice carrying the weight of total, unshakable certainty. We do not touch the wire transfer today. We don't cancel the cards tonight. Move too soon, and Clifford will claim the whole thing was a sloppy accounting error. Renata will say her brother was just a short-term consultant. We have to let them walk all the way to the edge of the plank before we cut it out from under them. We let the corrupt doctor process the fraudulent incompetence declaration. We let them spend the entire weekend believing they have won completely. We let them taste the $40 million. We let them feel the dizzying, intoxicating high of total victory. We wait until they are fully drunk on their own perceived brilliance. I want them to feel entirely untouchable. I got to my feet, buttoning my heavy coat with steady, unhurried hands. "I'll stay in the motel room through the weekend," I continued. Complete radio silence. Sunday evening, I will pack my bag, get in the truck, and drive back to the estate. Dorian closed his heavy laptop. "They are going to ambush you the moment you walk through that door," he cautioned. "They have the medical van reserved. The conservatorship papers are signed and filed. They fully intend to physically remove you from that house and deliver you to a psychiatric ward on Sunday. Are you certain you want to walk straight into that?" I looked down at the man who had stood at my side for decades. "Absolutely certain, Dorian," I said, a dangerous smile crossing my face. "They believe they are closing an inescapable trap around a frail, deteriorating old man. They have no idea I am the one walking through that door holding the remote detonator." I turned and walked out of the office, stepping down into the cool morning air. I drove back to that windowless motel room and spent the next 2 days watching the live camera feeds. I watched them toast their victory. I watched them stuff my personal belongings into cheap garbage bags. I watched them walk my living room measuring it for new furniture. I watched every moment of their premature celebration. And when the Sunday sun began dropping toward the horizon, pulling long, dark shadows across the landscape, I grabbed my duffel bag, climbed into my truck, and drove back to the estate, ready to walk directly into their ambush. The heavy tires crunched against the long gravel driveway as I wound my way toward the sprawling property. The dying light bled across the manicured lawns, painting the massive stone face of the house in deep shades of crimson and gray. I steered past the sculpted hedges and brought the truck to a stop in the circular driveway. When I cut the engine, the evening quiet fell like something solid. Sitting there parked brazenly near the front steps was a plain, unmarked white transit van, exactly as Clifford had described it on the hidden recording. The private medical transport crew had arrived to collect their helpless patient. 2 broad men in dark blue uniforms leaned against the side of the van, smoking and waiting for their cargo. I didn't give them a glance. I pulled my faded canvas duffel from the passenger seat, stepped out into the cool evening air, and walked slowly toward the heavy oak front door. I let my shoulders round forward and introduced a slight tremor to my hands as I reached for the brass handle. I pushed inside and stepped into the grand marble foyer. The ambush had been staged with care. Clifford and Renata stood together in the center of the wide entryway. They were not dressed for a quiet Sunday at home. They wore sharp, immaculate business attire radiating an aura of absolute authority. Resting on the polished marble floor at their feet were 4 cheap black plastic garbage bags bloated with my belongings. They hadn't bothered with proper suitcases. They had swept my life into the trash. Clifford stood tall, chest forward with arrogant confidence, a thick stack of legal documents gripped in his right hand. Renata positioned herself just behind his shoulder, arms folded across her chest, a cold, predatory smile fixed on her face. "Welcome home, Dad," Clifford said, his voice utterly stripped of the false, honeyed warmth he had wielded just 3 days earlier. The tone was flat, hard, and soaked in contempt. "We have been expecting you." I stopped near the door and let the canvas duffel slip from my fingers onto the floor with a soft thud. I took in the garbage bags, then brought my eyes back to my son, holding the wide, bewildered expression of a man losing his grip on the world around him. "What is happening, Clifford?" I asked, my voice catching with precisely calibrated frailty. "Why are my things in garbage bags? Who are those men out there by the white van?" Clifford took a slow, deliberate step forward and raised the stack of documents to my eye level. "The game is completely over," he said, slapping the papers against his open palm. "You are no longer in charge of anything here. On Friday afternoon, a board-certified neurologist came to this house and conducted a thorough assessment of your mental condition. Based on your erratic behavior, your severe memory failures, and your undeniable cognitive deterioration, he formally declared you unfit to manage your own affairs. He signed a declaration of incompetence. I filed it with the county court first thing Saturday morning. I am now your legal conservator. I hold absolute unquestioned power of attorney over your health care, your personal estate, and every asset belonging to Mercer Heavy Equipment. You are legally invisible. Renata moved forward, positioning herself squarely at her husband's side. We simply cannot allow you to go on endangering the company or yourself any further. Dral. She added, her voice dripping with a sickening, honeyed venom. You are a danger to this family. We have made arrangements for you to be safely transported to a high-security specialized state facility where you can receive the constant psychiatric supervision you so clearly require. The transport team is standing outside ready to escort you. You will be very comfortable there. I stood there looking at the two of them, taking in the full, breathtaking depth of their depravity. They had executed their scheme without a single misstep, banking entirely on my supposed frailty. Their own greed had so thoroughly consumed them that they had rendered themselves completely blind to the man actually standing before them. Clifford jabbed a stiff finger toward the open front door. You don't own a single thing anymore. He snarled, his voice climbing in volume, the words bouncing hard off the marble walls. Get out of this house! The command landed in the air like a blade, sharp and absolute. For one long, silent beat, I simply stood where I was. And then I stopped playing their game. A slow, steady breath left my body, and every tremor in my hands went with it. I rolled my shoulders back instantly, shedding the hunched, breakable posture I had maintained for weeks. I pulled my spine straight and rose to my full commanding height. The hazy, manufactured confusion drained out of my eyes and was replaced by a cold, razor-sharp clarity that cut across that foyer like something physical. I looked directly into Clifford's face, dropping the mask of the helpless old man and bringing back to life the ruthless chief executive who had ground industry rivals into dust for 4 decades. The transformation was instantaneous, and it was terrifying. Clifford physically recoiled, his body pulling back an involuntary half-step. That arrogant posture buckled, and a flash of real uncertainty moved across his face. Renata let her arms fall, her self-satisfied smile collapsing, as she stared at me in sudden, bewildered disbelief. They had expected tears. They expected me to plead, to crumble onto that marble floor, and beg for whatever scraps of dignity they might leave me. They had braced for a struggle, a pitiful, flailing episode they could easily write off as psychiatric breakdown for the transport team waiting outside. I gave them none of it. I did not argue. I did not speak a single word of protest or make a single appeal for my house. I simply looked at them with total, undeniable lucidity, acknowledged their betrayal with one slow, deliberate nod, reached down and picked up my heavy canvas duffel bag, turned my back on them both, and walked out the front door. I strode past the 2 transport drivers, paying no attention whatsoever to their baffled stares, and walked straight to my old, reliable Chevy truck. I climbed into the freezing cab, hauled the heavy door shut, and locked it. I sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield at the blazing foyer of my mansion. Clifford and Renata were framed in the doorway, watching my truck utterly thrown by my calm, wordless exit. They had won the physical ground, but my total absence of resistance had shaken them far more than any fight could have. I reached into the duffel bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. The screen flipped open, its bright glow filling the dark cab. I connected to the secure mobile hotspot and logged directly into the master executive portal of Mercer Heavy Equipment. Dorian had built the digital architecture flawlessly. The founder's clawback clause was armed and waiting on my final authorization, I opened the offshore tracking software and confirmed the exact position of the stolen capital. The $5 million was sitting quietly in Conrad's untraceable Cayman Islands account, completely still. They had parked it there, confident the power of attorney document would protect them from any corporate audit. They believed that money was entirely and permanently theirs. I placed my finger over the execution key. I looked up through the windshield one last time. Clifford was smiling again, pulling Renata close by the waist as they turned to head back inside my beautiful house, ready to toast their great financial triumph. I pressed the key. The digital command tore through the encrypted servers with devastating speed. The clawback protocol aggressively cut through standard international banking delays, drawing on the absolute foundational authority of the corporate charter to reverse the fraudulent wire transfer on the spot. On my glowing screen, I watched the balance in Conrad's offshore account plummet from $5 million to absolute zero in a fraction of a second. The stolen capital was wrenched violently from their grasp, instantly rerouted through the secure network, and locked permanently inside my completely inaccessible private personal trust. The money was gone. Their safety net had been vaporized entirely. Come morning, Dorian would execute the remaining directives. He would freeze their platinum corporate credit cards. He would formally deliver Clifford's termination papers for extreme gross misconduct. He would submit the full devastating dossier of secret audio recordings and forged medical documents directly to federal prosecutors at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were standing inside a $40 million mansion they no longer had any legal right to touch, stripped clean of their wealth, their titles, and their freedom. I closed the laptop, the screen snapping shut with a deeply satisfying click. I turned the key, letting the heavy diesel engine rumble to life. I put the truck in gear and pulled slowly away from the estate, leaving them sealed inside the gilded trap they had built for me. The trap was fully sprung. Let the countdown begin. Monday morning broke crisp and clear above the towering glass and steel skyline of Mercer Heavy Equipment. Clifford arrived at corporate headquarters just before 8, swinging his sleek black sports car into the private executive loading zone. He flipped his keys to the valet with a dismissive snap of his wrist chest, thrust forward with the bearing of a man who owned the world. He had on a custom-tailored slate blue suit and a silk tie dressed for the part of the newly crowned, undisputed chief executive officer. He pushed through the massive revolving glass doors and entered the sprawling sun-drenched marble lobby, which buzzed with morning traffic as hundreds of employees moved toward their departments. Clifford offered not a single acknowledgement to the reception staff or the junior managers he passed. He simply glided across the polished floor with a sickeningly self-important stride, fully convinced that within the hour he would be seated at the head of the boardroom table. He planned to deliver a tragic, carefully rehearsed statement regarding my sudden, irreversible medical decline and his reluctant but necessary rise to the corporate throne. He bypassed the main elevator bank and walked straight for the frosted glass doors of the private executive lift. That elevator required a platinum-tier clearance card that only the top 3 executives in the building possessed. Clifford reached into his slim leather wallet, pulled out his black identification badge, and held it up to the digital sensor with a smirk. He fully expected the familiar, welcoming green glow and the soft, mechanical click of the heavy doors parting. Instead, the sensor let out a sharp, aggressive beep, and a hard red light blazed across the small screen. Access denied. Clifford frowned, his smug expression stumbling. He breathed out a short sigh of pure irritation, concluding it was nothing more than a temporary glitch in the internal security network. He briskly rubbed the magnetic strip against the fine wool of his trousers, stepped up to the panel, and swiped his badge again with force. The machine answered immediately with another unforgiving red flash and a loud error tone that rang out sharply across that quiet corner of the busy lobby. Access denied. Clifford slammed his palm flat against the frosted glass, his face flooding with a sudden surge of deep, entitled fury. He drove his fist against the silver intercom button on the wall, fully prepared to verbally tear apart whoever was stationed in the security control room. "Open these doors right this instant!" Clifford demanded, his voice loud enough that several nearby employees stopped and turned to look. Before the intercom could register any response, heavy measured footsteps sounded from the main security corridor just to his left. Clifford turned, expecting a rattled junior guard rushing over to apologize for the system error and manually release the executive elevator doors. What he found instead was Leon, my director of corporate security, standing directly in front of him. I had hired Leon personally more than 20 years ago, right after he completed his final combat tour with the Marines. He was a massive, composed man who carried a bone-deep loyalty to me and an absolute zero tolerance for disrespect. Leon did not look at my son with a single ounce of deference or fear. He marched toward the executive elevator, flanked by two enormous uniformed security contractors. His expression wiped clean of any professional courtesy. In his large hands, Leon carried a plain brown cardboard box. Clifford narrowed his eyes and leveled an accusing finger at the security director. "Leon, fix this damn sensor immediately," he snapped, completely failing to read the dangerous shift in the room. "My card is locked, and I have a critical emergency board meeting to convene upstairs in exactly 15 minutes. Leon never broke his stride. He stopped less than 2 ft from my son, using the sheer wall of his physical presence to force Clifford back an involuntary step. "Your access card is not malfunctioning, Clifford," Leon said, his deep voice carrying a terrifyingly calm, absolute authority. "Your security clearance has been fully and permanently revoked by direct order of the founding chairman." The color drained instantly from Clifford's arrogant face. He stared up at the massive security director, his mouth working open and shut like a fish pulled from the water, his mind scrambling desperately to process the words he had just heard. "But that is a lie!" Clifford stammered, his voice cracking into an undignified, panicked pitch. "My father is a severely incapacitated, heavily medicated patient, currently being transported to a locked psychiatric ward. He cannot issue a single legal corporate directive. I am the sole acting authority of Mercer Heavy Equipment." Leon did not argue. He simply drove the plain cardboard box hard into Clifford's chest, leaving my son no choice but to wrap his arms around it instinctively to keep it from hitting the floor. Clifford looked down into the box. Resting inside were his expensive crystal desk paperweight, his custom silver pen set, and a framed photograph of Renata. Leon reached into his tactical jacket and produced a thick, heavy legal envelope bearing the unmistakable crest of Dorian Kellner's law firm. He slapped it squarely on top of the framed photograph. "You have been officially terminated for extreme documented gross financial misconduct, wire fraud, and the unauthorized theft of executive capital." Leon projected his voice with enough force that every person gathered in that lobby caught every single devastating word. "Your personal belongings have been packed. Your company vehicle has been impounded in the parking garage. You are legally trespassing on private commercial property. You have exactly 30 seconds to walk out those doors before I have you physically removed and deposited on the street." The entire lobby dropped into absolute suffocating silence. Dozens of employees stood frozen where they stood, watching the supposedly untouchable heir apparent being torn apart in full public view. Clifford trembled beneath the hard, unforgiving stare of the security team. His mind clawed frantically for some way to pull his shattered reality back together. It hit him then with absolute terrifying clarity. I had played him perfectly. I was not locked away in any cell. I had come back to the estate, slipped past their ambush, and razed his corporate empire to the ground. That realization broke him physically. He could not pull a coherent sentence together. He turned and made the humiliating, agonizingly long walk of shame past his former subordinates, clutching the cardboard box to his chest. Leon and his guards stayed close behind, aggressively marching him through the revolving glass doors and pushing him out onto the cold, hard concrete of the public sidewalk. Clifford stood alone on the curb, the bitter wind cutting straight through his expensive suit. He had lost the $40 million empire, but a desperate flicker of hope ignited somewhere in his chest. He dropped the box and frantically dialed Conrad's highly encrypted number, reaching for the stolen millions like a drowning man grabbing at a rope. The line hissed with dead air and rolled directly into a disconnected voicemail. While Clifford stood shivering on that sidewalk Monday morning, listening to the hollow echo of a dead line, he chose the coward's path. He spent the next 2 days hiding inside a cheap downtown hotel, frantically trying to reach Conrad, completely paralyzed by his sudden powerlessness. Renata, meanwhile, remained blissfully ignorant of her husband's total destruction. By Wednesday afternoon, her confidence had ripened into pure, uncut hubris. I sat in Dorian's office drinking black coffee and watching real-time alerts fire across the corporate financial monitoring software. Renata had taken her luxury SUV to the most exclusive shopping district in downtown Nashville. She strutted through the glass doors of an elite Swiss boutique, sailed past the velvet ropes with a leather handbag that cost more than a reliable car, and spent 2 hours commanding the full attention of 3 separate sales associates. In the end, she settled on a magnificent sapphire-set gold watch priced at exactly $16,000. Renata sank back into the plush velvet chair, exhaled with theatrical exhaustion, and reached casually into her designer handbag. Out came the heavy cold metal of the platinum corporate black card, the one directly linked to the executive expense account Dorian and I had frozen 48 hours earlier. She slid it across the glass counter with a triumphant smile, completely unaware she was pushing forward nothing more than a decorative piece of useless aluminum. The manager accepted the card with a polite bow and fed the metal chip into the encrypted payment terminal. The machine let out a sharp negative beep. The digital screen flashed a bright, merciless error message. Transaction declined. He carefully withdrew the card, buffed the chip with a soft microfiber cloth, and reinserted it for a second attempt. The terminal rejected it again, immediately. Another loud, embarrassing beep ringing out clearly through the hushed, immaculate boutique. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Mercer," the manager said quietly, his tone shifting from practiced deference to cautious professional distance. "Your financial institution has declined the authorization. Do you happen to have another form of payment available today?" Renata stared at the man as if he had physically struck her. "Don't be absolutely ridiculous!" She snapped, her voice climbing sharply and shredding the refined atmosphere of the room. "There are no spending limits. Run it again and bypass the manual security trigger." He ran the heavy metal card a third and final time. The terminal immediately locked the transaction and put up a bold red warning instructing the merchant to physically confiscate the card. The manager studied the screen, the color leaving his face. "Mrs. Mercer, I cannot process this payment," he said, his voice carrying a faint tremor as he drew the card out of her reach. "In fact, the banking system has explicitly instructed me to retain this card due to an active account freeze. I cannot return it to you." Renata shot up from the velvet chair, eyes wide with a volatile mixture of fury and sudden creeping dread. She snatched her designer handbag from the counter and leveled a look of pure, undiluted venom at the manager. "You will be hearing from my corporate attorneys before the end of the business day," she hissed, spinning on her heel and storming out of the boutique. She swept down the busy sidewalk, burning with the humiliation of the public rejection. She dropped into the driver's seat of her luxury SUV and slammed the door hard. Her chest heaved with ragged, furious breaths. She yanked her phone from her purse and aggressively dialed the private direct number for the elite wealth management division at our primary corporate bank, fully intending to scream at the branch manager, demand the immediate unfreezing of her platinum card, and secure the termination of the boutique manager who had dared to embarrass her. The line clicked open, and the measured, calm voice of the senior bank manager came through. Renata did not allow the man to finish his standard greeting. "What exactly is happening with my 2 corporate expense accounts?" she screamed, abandoning every last pretense of sophistication. "I am the wife of the chief executive officer of Mercer Heavy Equipment, and I just had my primary card declined and confiscated in public. You will correct this humiliating error immediately, or I will personally make sure you are standing in an unemployment line by tomorrow morning." A heavy, chilling silence settled over the line. The bank manager did not apologize. He did not scramble to soothe her. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, remote, and utterly stripped of the deferential warmth she expected. "Mrs. Mercer, your platinum corporate card was not declined due to a banking error." He stated, his tone flat and immovable. The corporate accounts were permanently frozen on Monday morning by a direct, legally unappealable order from the founding chairman, Gerald Mercer. Furthermore, we have received official corporate documentation confirming that your husband, Clifford Mercer, has been terminated from his position for severe documented financial misconduct. Renata went rigid in the leather driver's seat, her furious breathing stopping dead. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream that her husband was the legal conservator, but the words died entirely in her throat. The bank manager pressed on, delivering the killing blow with ruthless precision. "Due to this termination, we have immediately reviewed your personal financial standing, Mrs. Mercer. As of this morning, Gerald Mercer has formally and legally removed his name as the primary financial guarantor on your residential mortgage. Without his substantial capital backing, and given that neither you nor your husband currently possesses verifiable income, you are in full default of the primary loan agreement. The bank is executing an immediate accelerated call on the entire outstanding balance. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the property before we initiate formal foreclosure and eviction proceedings. Have a pleasant afternoon, Mrs. Mercer." The line went completely dead. Renata sat trapped inside her expensive vehicle, the phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the passenger floorboard. The whole world tilted on its axis, spinning beyond her control. Her luxurious reality was collapsing around her in real time. She grabbed her phone in a panic and stared at the screen, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. There they were, dozens of vague, desperate text messages from Clifford that she had left completely unread for 2 days. He had not been busy restructuring anything. He had been hiding. A cold, suffocating wave of pure terror rolled over her. If the corporate accounts were locked and Clifford was officially terminated, the massive internal coup had failed entirely. And if the coup had failed, it meant I had somehow uncovered their offshore transfer. Renata gasped, the full weight of the realization crashing into her mind with sudden, violent force. They did not have the $5 million. They had no executive positions, and now they were on the verge of losing their magnificent home. Absolute, undeniable panic took hold. The crushing reality of their situation descended on my son and his wife like a collapsing ceiling. By Friday morning, the lavish facade Clifford had so carefully constructed over the past 3 years had shattered completely. For 48 grinding hours, he had been holed up in a cheap downtown hotel, burning through his phone battery, frantically trying to reach Conrad and get his hands on the stolen offshore funds. But Conrad had simply vanished, leaving my son utterly isolated and financially destroyed. Renata had returned to their heavily mortgaged mansion, in a state of complete unhinged hysteria, screaming about frozen accounts and the eviction notice the primary lender had just delivered. They were cornered, stripped of their corporate authority, their stolen millions, and the pristine social standing they had spent years building. In his desperate state, Clifford convinced himself he could still outmaneuver me. He cooked up a reckless, pathetic scheme to double down on the medical fraud. He persuaded himself that if he could just force the corrupt physician to produce a secondary psychiatric evaluation, he could somehow prop up the original conservatorship. Clifford left the downtown hotel just before 9:00 on Friday morning. He had no sports car. The corporate security team had already pulled it from the executive garage. He was reduced to ordering a standard rideshare sitting rigid in the back seat as the driver worked through heavy traffic toward the upscale medical district on the western edge of the city. Clifford stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. His expensive navy suit was badly wrinkled, his usually immaculate hair wrecked by days of grinding sleepless stress. He ran through his demands in his head, fully intending to walk into that private clinic, slam his fist on the reception desk, and threaten the doctor with total financial ruin if the man refused to produce the necessary forged medical addendums. He needed a sworn document signed under penalty of perjury, stating that I was actively suffering from severe dementia and that my sudden corporate actions were the product of a dangerous psychotic break. The rideshare turned off the main boulevard and eased down the tree-lined avenue leading straight to the private concierge clinic. Clifford reached for the door handle, his heart hammering with desperate hope. But as the car swung around the final corner, the driver hit the brakes hard, throwing Clifford forward in his seat. The clinic's beautifully manicured parking lot was completely unrecognizable. It had been sealed off by a fleet of dark, unmarked SUVs. Bright red and blue emergency lights strobed violently against the pristine glass face of the building. Dozens of federal agents in dark navy windbreakers, bold yellow FBI letters across their backs, swarmed the property like a relentless, coordinated force. Clifford went rigid, the breath catching hard in his throat. He ordered the driver to pull over and park across the street, his eyes wide with paralyzing terror. Through the tinted window, my son watched the methodical, ruthless dismantling of his only remaining lifeline. A team of agents marched out through the glass double doors, carrying heavy cardboard boxes stuffed with seized medical records, encrypted hard drives, and private patient files. They were taking apart the corrupt practice piece by piece. Moments later, the scene tipped into pure nightmare territory for Clifford. Two heavily armed federal agents emerged from the clinic with a firm grip on the arms of the immaculately dressed doctor who had visited my estate just 7 days prior. The physician was no longer radiating the cold, professional bearing of a corporate assassin. His expensive charcoal gray jacket was rumpled. His crimson tie hung loose around his neck, and his hands were pinned behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The agents steered the disgraced doctor toward the open rear doors of a waiting transport vehicle. Clifford watched the man's face, expecting to see some trace of stoic defiance. What he saw instead was a man, completely broken eyes, darting wildly across the parking lot in a state of raw, undeniable panic. For years, the doctor had sold his medical oath to the highest bidder, confident that his wealthy, powerful clients would forever insulate him from any legal consequence. But Dorian Kellner had executed my directives with devastating, flawless precision. On Tuesday morning, Dorian had not filed a routine corporate complaint. He had formally delivered the complete legal dossier directly to the highest levels of the federal prosecutor's office and the state medical licensing board, and he had handed them the ultimate weapon, the crystal-clear, high-definition footage captured by the hidden camera inside my living room outlet. Federal authorities had sat in their secure offices and watched my son reach into his breast pocket and pull out the thick manila envelope packed with tightly banded stacks of untraceable cash. They had watched the undeniable visual evidence of that heavy bribe sliding across my glass coffee table. They had heard the audio recording of the doctor validating a profound, life-destroying lie without asking a single medical question or performing any physical examination whatsoever. Faced with incontrovertible high-definition video evidence of federal wire fraud, medical malpractice, and criminal conspiracy, the doctor had no room left to move. He did not try to protect his wealthy client. The instant federal agents kicked through the door of his clinic, the cowardly physician folded without hesitation. He offered full cooperation with the federal investigation on the spot, eagerly pointing the finger straight at Clifford Mercer in a desperate bid to shave time off his own prison sentence. Clifford sat slumped in the back of the idling car, watching the heavy metal doors of the federal transport van slam shut, sealing the corrupt doctor inside permanently. The sheer scale of the disaster finally crushed the last remnant of his arrogant delusion. He understood now that the federal agents were not picking at a minor corporate dispute. They were executing a massive, tightly coordinated criminal takedown built on rock-solid, irrefutable evidence. He was no longer a powerful executive waging a corporate battle. He was a prime suspect in a federal fraud investigation, and the authorities were already rolling up his co-conspirators one by one. He ordered the driver to leave the area immediately, his voice shaking so badly he could barely push the words out. The car pulled from the curb, leaving the flashing lights behind. But the suffocating darkness of his reality came with him. As the vehicle merged onto the busy highway, Clifford's phone erupted with a loud, jarring ringtone. He looked down at the glowing screen. It was the expensive criminal defense attorney he had frantically placed on retainer the previous afternoon. He swiped a trembling finger across the glass to answer. The lawyer spoke fast. Clifford, the district attorney, is currently preparing a massive federal indictment for wire fraud and elder abuse. Your father recorded everything. They were completely and utterly trapped. The weekend crawled by a slow, agonizing descent into inescapable ruin for my son and his wife. While they drowned their Saturday in a nightmare of frantic legal consultations and brutal bank foreclosure notices, I quietly relocated. I had instructed Dorian to secure a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse on the highest floor of a premier luxury high-rise at the very center of downtown Nashville. I had no desire to return to the estate just yet. I wanted a clean, stripped-down environment. The penthouse offered floor-to-ceiling glass on every side, with an unobstructed, commanding view of the glittering city skyline. I spent Sunday evening sitting in a low-profile leather armchair, holding a heavy crystal glass of neat bourbon, watching the distant headlights weave along the crowded highways below. The deep, enveloping quiet of that penthouse was profoundly soothing. It was the pure, undiluted peace of a man who had successfully cut a malignant tumor out of his life. I felt no lingering sorrow. I felt no parental guilt. I had simply leveled the playing field and let gravity handle the rest. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid, savoring the rich, complex flavor as the digital clock on the wall slipped silently to 9:00. That deep silence was suddenly shattered by a loud, aggressive pounding thundering from the main entrance corridor. The heavy, reinforced mahogany door shook under the sheer force of the frantic blows. I did not flinch or spring from my chair. I simply set my glass down on the coffee table, my expression hardening into a cold, flat mask. I knew exactly who was on the other side of that door. The concierge security team in the main lobby was notoriously tight, but raw, uncut desperation has a remarkable way of sharpening human ingenuity. Clifford had likely slipped through the private service elevator or followed a wealthy resident through the secure underground garage. The frantic pounding climbed into a desperate rhythmic hammering. Muffled, pathetic voices bled through the thick wood voices that carried none of the arrogant, commanding authority they had wielded just days before. "Dad, please open the door!" Clifford shouted, his voice fracturing with high-pitched, unmistakable panic. "We know you are in there. Please, you have to talk to us." I rose from the chair, smoothing the front of my tailored dress shirt. I moved at a deliberate, unhurried pace across the wide expanse of polished hardwood, letting the steady quiet of my footsteps stand in sharp contrast to the chaos bleeding through the door. I reached the entryway, laid my hand flat against the cool metal handle, and pulled it open, revealing the pitiful, shattered remnants of my legacy standing in the brightly lit corridor. The physical change in my son and his wife was staggering. Clifford, the man who had swaggered through my corporate lobby demanding total control, was now an unkempt, trembling shell. His eyes were bloodshot and deeply sunken, ringed by bruised, purple shadows. His expensive clothes hung off him like they belonged to someone else. Renata stood shivering at his side, completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, greasy wreck. Her designer makeup was smeared in heavy dark streaks down her pale cheeks, ugly lines of ruined mascara carving their way across her skin. The instant the door swung open, Clifford physically collapsed. His knees hit the carpeted hallway floor with a dull, heavy thud. He thrust his hands forward, weeping openly like a frightened, broken child. "Dad, please!" Clifford choked out his chest, heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "You have to stop this. You have to call the federal prosecutors and make this go away. We are losing everything. The bank is aggressively foreclosing on the mansion. My corporate accounts are completely frozen. The criminal defense attorney said the district attorney is formally seeking 15 years in federal prison for the wire fraud and the elder abuse charges. 15 years. Dad, you cannot do this to me. We are family." Renata sagged against the doorframe, sobbing without any restraint. Her hands trembled as she pressed them over her face, unable to even lift her eyes to meet mine. "Please, Gerald," she wailed, her voice a wretched, high-pitched shriek. "We will do absolutely anything you want. We will sign the house back over to you. We will publicly apologize. Just please call off the federal agents. We are begging you." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two miserable figures crumpled on the floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I showed them not a single trace of anger. The complete absence of emotion in my posture seemed to terrify them far more than any explosion could have. I reached slowly into the pocket of my trousers and drew out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen with a calm, deliberate motion, paying no attention whatsoever to their pathetic, whimpering pleas. I opened the encrypted audio file, pushed the media volume to its absolute maximum, and pressed play. The crystal-clear, high-definition recording rang out through the quiet, sterile hallway, cutting straight through their hysterical sobbing like a blade. "You know, darling," Renata's recorded voice purred, soaked in that cruel, casual indifference. "Now that we finally possess absolute legal control over his entire estate, we really do not need to wait for his failing health to naturally run its course. I already toured that awful, underfunded state facility right near the border. We can easily lock him away in their maximum security psychiatric ward by Monday morning, and with the aggressive medication protocols I have authorized, the clueless old man will permanently forget his own name before the end of the month." Clifford and Renata froze solid. Every drop of color left their faces, turning their skin a sickly, translucent white. The sheer, undeniable horror of hearing their own murderous conspiracy played back at full volume silenced their desperate begging entirely. They stared up at me with wide, hollow eyes, finally grasping the full, terrifying scale of the trap they had blindly walked into. They had assumed I was acting out of sudden anger or impulsive spite. Now they finally understood that I had engineered their total destruction with cold, methodical precision. I looked down at Clifford in silence, my expression settling into solid granite. "I built a massive industrial empire specifically for you," I said, my voice carrying a low, dangerous finality. "I gave my youth and my blood to make certain you would never know a single day of genuine hardship. And in return, you paid a corrupt stranger to chemically erase my mind and bury me alive inside a state-funded nightmare. You are not my family anymore. You are nothing but a catastrophically bad corporate investment, and I have permanently cut my losses. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my house before the private security team removes you physically." I stepped back into the penthouse, gripped the heavy brass handle, and slammed the solid mahogany door directly in their terrified, ruined faces. The deadbolt engaged with a sharp, final click that echoed down the corridor. 1 week passed with agonizing, poetic symmetry. The great limestone gates of my former estate hung slightly ajar, drained of the energy that had once defined my family home. The bank had moved with ruthless efficiency, triggering the foreclosure acceleration clause the moment the financial guarantees were legally dissolved. The vast rooms where Clifford and Renata had toasted their fraudulent victory were now entirely empty, filled with nothing but the hollow whistle of the wind moving through them. My son and his wife had been formally arrested on Tuesday morning, walked out of the house in handcuffs before the autumn sun had fully cleared the mist. Dorian had ensured the bail parameters were set exceptionally high, draining the very last of their personal savings just to keep them out of a holding cell ahead of their arraignment. Now, by a strange and exquisite twist of cosmic justice, they were the ones confined inside a cramped, suffocating room at a cheap motel on the edge of town. They sat on a sagging mattress surrounded by stained walls and the faint smell of old grease, staring blankly at a growing pile of federal legal indictments. The $5 million was gone. Their corporate titles had been stripped away entirely. They were out on bail, facing a minimum of 15 years in the federal prison for wire fraud, forgery, and criminal elder abuse. With no financial lifeline left to reach, for their flawless corporate coup had crumbled into cold, lifeless ash. While they sat in that dingy motel room, mourning the death of their stolen wealth, I chose to return to the place where my life had always truly belonged. On Friday morning, just as the early shift change was getting underway, I drove my old, reliable Chevy truck through the heavy iron gates of the primary manufacturing facility of Mercer Heavy Equipment. I did not pull into the designated executive space. I parked out in the open yard, stepped out into the brisk morning air. I drew a deep, steady breath, letting the familiar weight of diesel-burning weld wire and fresh-turned dirt fill my lungs entirely. It was the intoxicating smell of honest, back-breaking labor, the very same scent that had carried me through 40 years of relentless industry. The toxic rot that had threatened to consume everything I had built was now completely and cleanly cut away. I walked into the main glass office lobby, nodding calmly to the reception staff, who met me with genuine deep respect in their eyes. I continued down to the supervisor locker room, reached up to the top shelf of my old metal locker, and lifted out my original battered orange hard hat. It was scratched, dented, and faded from decades under the brutal Tennessee sun. But the moment I settled it firmly onto my head, an overwhelming surge of strength moved back through my body. I am 70 years old now. I am entirely alone without the family I believed I was building a kingdom for. But I am also completely and beautifully free. The dark cloud of deceit had lifted. The corporate empire was clean again. The traitors within were facing justice, and the man who built this kingdom was back on his throne, clearer-headed and stronger than he had ever been. A new dawn had finally arrived to carry me forward. I walked out onto the main assembly floor, the concrete trembling beneath my boots, as the massive overhead cranes swung giant steel girders across the bay. The rhythmic, deafening thunder of the hydraulic presses hit like a powerful heartbeat, a declaration that Mercer Heavy Equipment was alive, thriving, and entirely unbowed. The workers, men and women who had stood by this company for decades, lifted their eyes from their stations as I moved past. They did not see a frail, fading old man who needed to be locked away in some state ward. They saw the founder. They saw the man who had looked them straight in the eye through economic recessions and given them his word that their families would always be taken care of. I climbed the metal stairs to the elevated observation deck and looked out over the entire industrial complex. The complex stretched across 280 acres of pure American industry. It struck me then that a founder's true legacy is never held inside the walls of a grand mansion or measured by the surface glitter of an expensive lifestyle. A legacy is forged in the respect you earn, the integrity you hold on to, and the unyielding strength you show when the entire world is actively working to bring you down. Clifford had believed that a single forged document and a corrupt medical seal could wipe out 40 years of history, but he had fatally underestimated the foundational power of a self-made man. He had forgotten that you cannot simply take a kingdom from the man who dragged it up out of the dirt with his own bare hands. My absolute command over what I created remains completely indisputable. Now, the hardest and most agonizing truth any parent will ever confront in their lifetime is that unconditional love does not guarantee loyalty in return. You can spend 40 long years breaking your own body, fracturing your health, and burning your youth to build a beautiful kingdom for your children, only to discover too late that you have raised greedy usurpers rather than grateful heirs. You believe that by shielding them from the world's harsh realities, you are protecting them, but all you are truly doing is feeding an insatiable entitlement that will eventually turn and devour you. But age does not equal weakness, and gray hair does not signal a fading mind. Real strength is not simply about how hard you can work to provide for an ungrateful family. It is about having the absolute unbreakable courage to stand up, walk away, and completely cut the toxic rot out of your life. If you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this, I want you to know I see you. And I think you already understand why this story needed to be told. Looking back on everything, Gerald walked through the betrayal inside his own walls, the forged papers, the stolen millions, the plan to erase his mind. What strikes me most is not the cunning of the revenge. It is the cost. He spent 40 years building something real only to discover that the ones he built it for had been treating it as an inheritance they could simply take. I believe God allows certain betrayals to reach us, not to destroy us, but to strip away the illusions we were never meant to carry. Gerald did not just reclaim his money, he reclaimed himself. Here is what these father stories teach us plainly and without softening it. First, loyalty is not inherited. It is earned on both sides of the relationship. Never assume love alone guarantees it. Second, if someone is working against you, silence is your greatest weapon. Do not warn them. Build your case, then move. Third, the moment you mistake a man's patience for weakness, you have already made the last mistake you will make on his watch. Fourth, family justice does not always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like consequences delivered with complete calm and without apology. If this story reached something inside you, if it brought up your own questions about family trust or what you would do if you were in Gerald's position, I want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this one, please pass it along. That is how these stories find the people who need them most. Subscribe to Alpha Dad Stories so you do not miss what is coming next. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself, and I will talk to you again soon.